The conservative believes that the moral imperative of all public policy must be the preservation and improvement of American society. Similarly, the object of American foreign policy must be no different. The founders recognized that America had to be strong politically, economically, culturally, and militarily to survive and thrive in a complex, ever-changing global environment, not only in their time, but for all time. History bears this out. After the Revolutionary War, the founders realized that the Confederation was inadequate to conduct foreign affairs, since each state was free to act on its own. There could be no coherent national security policy, because there was no standing army, and each state ultimately was responsible for its own defense. The nation's economy was vulnerable to pirates who were terrorizing transatlantic shipping routes, and thereby inhibiting trade and commerce. And the British and Spanish empires were looming threats. The authority of the national government to raise and maintain a standing army and use military power within the framework of a republican system was among the first matters addressed by the framers when they presented the finished Constitution to the states for ratification. After reviewing a litany of European interests and conflicts in North America, John Jay in Federalist 4 wrote, "The people of America are aware that inducements to war may arise out of these circumstances, as well as from others not so obvious at present, and that whenever such inducements may find fit time and opportunity for operation, pretenses to color and justify them will not be wanting. Wisely, therefore, do they consider union and a good national government as necessary to put and keep them in such a situation as, instead of inviting war, will tend to repress and discourage it. The situation consists in the best possible state of defense, and necessarily depends on the government, the arms, and the resources of the country." Indeed, one of the stated purposes of the Constitution is to provide for the common defense. The framers understood the complementary purposes of domestic and foreign policy. George Washington's farewell address of 1796 is often misunderstood as a proclamation of isolationism. This ignores its historical context. At the time, Washington was concerned with the very survival of the young nation. The address is a call for prudence, not only in dealings and relationships with foreign states, but in issues that threaten national unity. In his address, Washington warned against the influences of popular passions on establishing permanent and overarching allegiances to, or prejudices against, any foreign power. He issued his warning because the American public was deeply divided in its sentiments relating to the European powers that were at war. The nascent political parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, or Democratic Republicans, were coalescing around support for different countries, the Federalists for Britain, the Anti-Federalists for France. Throughout his presidency, Washington tried to steer a course of strict neutrality between the two countries, while promoting commercial relationships and vigorous trade with both sides in the conflict. The address makes clear he did so, not because neutrality was an end in itself, but because he feared that taking sides could split the country apart. Washington also believed that the nation's survival required a strong national defense. In his first annual message to Congress on January 8, 1790, barely 8 months after taking office, Washington said, "Among the many interesting objects which will engage your attention, that of providing for the common defense will merit particular regard. To be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace." In his fifth annual message on December 3, 1793, Washington offered a stronger, more substantial elaboration of this principle. "There is a rank due to the United States among nations which will be withheld, if not absolutely lost, by the reputation of weakness. If we desire to avoid insult, we must be able to repel it. If we desire to secure peace, one of the most powerful instruments of our rising prosperity, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war. But few knew better than Washington that America must establish alliances that have as their purpose the protection and well-being of the nation. Without the crucial material aid and military support of France and other nations, the decisive Battle of Yorktown, and perhaps the Revolutionary War itself, might have been lost. Washington was neither an isolationist nor an interventionist. Yes, Washington was skeptical of alliances, but when in America's best interests, he made them. Washington preferred diplomacy to war, but he knew war was sometimes unavoidable. By word and deed, as general, president, and statesman, Washington spent his public life pursuing the preservation and improvement of American society. Washington's example is thus flexibility in means to achieve the immutable end, national security. Agreeing with Washington, Claremont Institute senior fellow and University of Dallas professor Thomas West writes, "For the founders, foreign and domestic policy were supposed to serve the same end, the security of the people in their person and property. Therefore, foreign policy was conceived primarily as defensive. Foreign attack was to be deterred by having strong arms, or repulsed by force. Alliances were to be entered into with the understanding that a self-governing nation must keep itself aloof from the quarrels of other nations, except as needed for national defense. Government had no right to spend the taxes or lives of its own citizens to spread democracy to other nations, or to engage in enterprises aiming at imperialistic hegemony." West would also agree, however, that a defensive foreign policy does not exclude the necessity of preemptive action. In 1787, James Wilson, a prominent founder, rejected the argument that America had to wait until attacked to exercise military power, and mocked the proponents of this notion. "Whatever may be the provocation, however important the object in view, and however necessary dispatch and secrecy may be, still the declaration must precede the preparation, and the enemy will be informed of your intentions, not only before you are equipped for an attack, but even before you are fortified for a defense. The consequence is too obvious to require any further delineation." Of course, there are occasions when America has suffered grievously, including on 9/11, for failing to act preemptively. Moreover, in the age of rogue regimes pursuing nuclear weapons, there clearly are occasions when preemption is prudent. For a government to be irresolute in the face of a growing or imminent threat to its citizenry is suicidal. What of the notion of spreading democracy to other nations, which in one form or another appears to be part of the strategy of recent administrations of both political parties? In 2005, columnist George Will put the question to William F. Buckley, Jr., asking about the war in Iraq. Will: "Today we have a very different kind of foreign policy, and the premise of the Bush Doctrine is that America must spread democracy because our national security depends upon it. And America can spread democracy. It knows how. It can engage in nation building. This is conservative or not?" Buckley: "It's not at all conservative. It's anything but conservative. It's not conservative at all, inasmuch as conservatism doesn't invite unnecessary challenges. It insists on coming to terms with the world as it is, and the notion that merely by affirming these high ideals we can effect highly entrenched systems." Will: "But something odd is happening in conservatism, and we have a president, George W. Bush, and an administration that clearly is conservative, accepted as that. Yet it is nation-building in the Middle East. And conservatism seems to be saying government can't run Amtrak, but it can run the Middle East." Buckley: "The ambition of conservatism properly extends to saying that where there are no human rights, it's not a society I can truly respect. It's impossible to draw up a template that gives us an orderly sense of send democracy there, but let this go for a while. One recognizes that you can't export democracy everywhere simultaneously. Certainly America cannot export democracy everywhere simultaneously, nor should it attempt to. For one thing, it is impractical. There are cultures and regimes that are not receptive to such overtures. Furthermore, the loss of American lives and the enormous financial costs in chasing such unrealistic ends would threaten the preservation and improvement of American society. It would demoralize the population and desensitize it to real threats that endanger the society. However, there are occasions when democracy building is prudent. The European Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan of 1948, had among its purposes the promotion and preservation of democracy through the provision of billions of dollars in economic and military aid to several European nations defeated in World War II. Among other things, it would and did help repel the spread of Soviet communism through what remained of free Europe, which was clearly in America's interests. More recently, while democracy may not take hold in Afghanistan for the long term, it is still a perfectly sound objective, given the vacuum that was filled by the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's defeat in that country and America's subsequent disassociation. The key is that these decisions must never be motivated by utopianism or imperialism, but by actual circumstances requiring the defense of America against real threats. As for Iraq, the Will-Buckley exchange suggests their opposition to the war was a larger criticism of a perceived doctrine requiring the imposition of democracy worldwide, although Will has also called Iraq a war of choice. America has engaged in wars of choice in the past, including during the 19th century, when, under the banner of manifest destiny, the United States government increased American territory by military threat and force to include the Southwest, West, and Pacific Northwest. The expansion of the nation's contiguous borders has undoubtedly improved American society. While America may have felt threatened from Britain, Mexico, and other countries that controlled these territories, the fact is that the nation was intent on expansion. If the war in Iraq is understood as an effort to defeat a hostile regime that threatened both America's allies and interests in the region, the war and the subsequent attempt at democratic governance in that country can be justified as consistent with founding and conservative principles. Indeed, since the Will-Buckley exchange, when victory in Iraq appeared elusive to some, changes in military and political strategies dramatically improved the situation. Of course, Iraq is not necessarily a model for future engagements, but nor can it be easily dismissed as unreasonable and imprudent. Saddam's Iraq had a history of aggressive behavior against America's ally, Kuwait, and threatened Saudi Arabia, and had actively pursued nuclear weapons, such as Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor, destroyed by Israel in 1981. The United States and its allies no longer face the prospect of a nuclear Iraq under the control of a megalomaniac. For now, at least, it is one less destabilizing threat to American interests. Conversely, America has, will, and must make alliances with non-democratic regimes, and even former enemies, if, under the right circumstances, doing so preserves and improves American society. During World War II, the United States allied with the Soviet Union in order to defeat the Axis powers, including Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was a genocidal imperialistic regime, but America's survival was at stake, and in fact, the alliance did preserve the nation. Subsequent to World War II, the Soviet Union was America's greatest threat. When President Jimmy Carter based his foreign policy on advancing human rights worldwide, it not only led to Soviet expansionism in Afghanistan, Africa, and Latin America, but also toppled the Shah of Iran, a longtime American ally, and catalyzed the Islamic fundamentalist movement throughout and is the single most destabilizing force in the Middle East. The doctrinal, rather than prudential promotion of democracy or human rights as practiced by Carter, can be destructive of America's best interests. The conservative believes that unalienable rights attach to all human beings, but it is not necessarily the responsibility of the United States to enforce those rights. How can it be? However, he also believes that there are times when evil perpetrated by a regime is so horrific that to ignore it tears at the moral core of American civil society. Although there can be no single doctrine that defines the elements of action or inaction in every case, once again, prudence must dictate if and when the cost of American lives and treasure is worth intervention on these grounds. The conservative does not seek rigid adherence to any specific course of action, neutrality or alliance, preemptive war or defensive posture, nation-building or limited military strike. The benchmark, again, is whether any specific path will serve the nation's best interests. It is difficult to imagine a theory under which a society could otherwise survive. Indeed, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, and its various iterations since, stand today for the proposition that the United States will not tolerate threats against its survival, whether in the Western Hemisphere or anywhere in the world. For the statist, however, U.S. foreign policy is another opportunity to enhance his own authority at the expense of the civil society. In 2007, then-Senator Barack Obama set forth his views to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. In today's globalized world, the security of the American people is inextricably linked to the security of all people. When narco-trafficking and corruption threaten democracy in Latin America, it's America's problem too. When poor villagers in Indonesia have no choice but to send chickens to market infected with avian flu, it cannot be seen as a distant concern. When religious schools in Pakistan teach hatred to young children, our children are threatened as well. Whether it's global terrorism or pandemic disease, dramatic climate change, or the proliferation of weapons of mass annihilation, the threats we face at the dawn of the 21st century can no longer be contained by borders and boundaries. And America must lead by reaching out to all those living disconnected lives of despair in the world's forgotten corners. Because while there will always be those who succumb to hate and strap bombs to their bodies, there are millions more who want to take another path, who want our beacon of hope to shine its light their way. Another way America will lead again is to invest in our common humanity, to ensure that those who live in fear and want today can live with dignity and opportunity tomorrow. We have heard much over the last 6 years about how America's larger purpose in the world is to promote the spread of freedom, that it is the yearning of all who live in the shadow of tyranny and despair. I agree. But this yearning is not satisfied by simply deposing a dictator and setting up a ballot box. The true desire of all mankind is not only to live free lives, but lives marked by dignity and opportunity, by security and simple justice. Delivering on these universal aspirations requires basic sustenance, like food and clean water, medicine and shelter. It also requires a society that is supported by the pillars of a sustainable democracy, a strong legislature, an independent judiciary, the rule of law, a vibrant civil society, a free press, and an honest police force. It requires building the capacity of the world's weakest states and providing them what they need to reduce poverty, build healthy and educated communities, develop markets, and generate wealth. And it requires states that have the capacity to fight terrorism, halt the proliferation of deadly weapons, and build the healthcare infrastructure needed to prevent and treat such deadly diseases as HIV/AIDS and malaria. But if the next president can restore the American people's trust, if they know that he or she is acting with their best interests at heart, with prudence and wisdom, and some measure of humility, then I believe the American people will be ready to see America lead again. several elements of Obama's global vision must be addressed. When he says, "The security of the American people is inextricably linked to the security of all people," what is meant by security of all people of the world? How in every case is America's security related to their security? It clearly is not. And if a regime refuses to secure for its people that which America believes it should, what then? Moreover, are there not times when the security of other people conflicts with the security of America? And America must lead by reaching out to all those living disconnected lives of despair in the world's forgotten corners. What does it mean to live a disconnected life of despair? If included among the disconnected, for example, are the millions of starving people living under the iron fist of North Korean communism, how do Americans reach out to them? But disconnected lives of despair appears to mean much more than the denial of liberty to people in the forgotten corners of the world. It is a Messianic attitude that has no basis in reality. Another way America will lead again is to invest in our common humanity, to ensure that those who live in fear and want today can live with dignity and opportunity tomorrow. America will invest what and where? And how can America ensure that people in, say, Zimbabwe and scores of other places can live with dignity and opportunity? And does such a purpose and mission exclude Iraq, where Saddam Hussein was terrorizing and brutalizing large segments of the Iraqi population? And if not, why not? Delivering on these universal aspirations requires basic sustenance, like food and clean water, medicine and shelter. It also requires a society that is supported by the pillars of a sustainable democracy, a strong legislature, an independent judiciary, the rule of law, a vibrant civil society, a free press, and an honest police force. It requires building the capacity of the world's weakest states and providing them what they need to reduce poverty, build healthy and educated communities, develop markets, and generate wealth. And how are these things to be accomplished? No insight is provided into the myriad of complicated and complex obstacles, both within the United States and in other countries, that would have to be overcome, because they are too numerous to make tangible and too onerous to accomplish. Moreover, if the government were to compel Americans to give of their labor, treasure, and lives to chase the unachievable, an imagined global civil society, America could not survive or improve upon itself. But if the next president can restore the American people's trust, if they know that he or she is acting with their best interests at heart, with prudence and wisdom, and some measure of humility, then I believe the American people will be ready to see America lead again. How would this restore the American people's trust? And in whom and what? How is committing them to a staggeringly unrealistic global task acting in their best interests? Where is the prudence and wisdom in such a reckless overstatement of human possibilities, which completely ignores history and man's experience? In truth, the statist is and will be no more successful in his foreign policy promises than in his domestic promises. International utopianism has no better chance than its domestic brand. But for all his talk of America changing the world, the statist speaks not of American sovereignty, but global citizenship. He speaks not of America as a nation-state, but as one nation among many. Rather than maintain its superpower status and act in its own best interests, the United States should relinquish its hard-earned position in favor of multilateral power sharing and conduct foreign policy, including decisions about military action in its own defense, through coalitions and international organizations. In this way, America's interests are subsumed and contained by the supposed interests of the whole, and the rest of the world will look approvingly upon the United States for empowering other countries to participate in decisions about America's survival. The statist seeks treaties not to preserve and improve American society, but to commit the United States to a course of conduct that cannot be easily reversed with the change of administrations. He will enter into treaties that include the Convention on the Rights of the Child, signed in 1995, but not ratified due to sovereignty and other concerns, the Convention on All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which the Senate has refused to ratify since President Carter signed it in 1980, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, signed by Clinton in 1996, rejected by the Senate in 1999, the Kyoto Protocol on Climate Change, signed by Clinton in 1998, but never ratified. Bush withdrew it in 2001. The Convention on the Law of the Sea, which would restrict U.S. commercial and military operations, but the Senate has not taken it up. And the International Criminal Court, which the United States has not joined. In each instance, decisions will be made through international bureaucracies that do not have as their moral imperative the preservation and improvement of American society. This is a dangerous gambit. America's adversaries and enemies do not consider themselves global citizens, nor are they constrained by international sensibilities and arrangements. A resurgent Russia, an aggressive China, communist movements growing in Latin America, rogue regimes in North Korea and Iran, Islamic terrorism, to name a few, all reject the statists' utopia as a weakness to be exploited. They are not motivated by world opinion, but by their own desires. They seek strategic, economic, and military advantage. For example, while China locks up oil contracts with countries in Africa and Latin America, and Russia lays claim to the North Pole to expand its access to crude oil, the statist asserts that America is only 5% of the world's population, but consumes 1/4 of the world's total energy supply, suggesting that America must become poorer so the rest of the world might become richer. The statist believes Americans are gluttonous and wasteful, taking from the world that which belongs to others, whereas the conservative believes Americans are successful and productive, contributing to their own preservation and improvement. The United States also produces and supplies goods and services to the rest of the world, thereby improving their lot. Furthermore, many other countries are incapable of accessing or utilizing natural resources as a result of their own governments, cultures, and societies. Despite the statist's lofty talk of global citizenship, in practice he protects, if not augments, his domestic position. Therefore, he opposes free trade, because it would alienate his union constituency, which sees protectionism as job security. He opposes the use of DDT to eradicate diseases in the most impoverished areas of the world, to appease his environmental acolytes, for whom DDT is a cause célèbre. The statist will guard from the international community factions within American society that he considers essential to his authority. The conservative, on the other hand, will restrict or prevent the provision of certain technologies and military know-how to hostile regimes, through such mechanisms as export controls, thereby limiting free trade with such regimes, not to benefit a favored constituency or enhance his own authority, but to preserve America's security, which in turn preserves free trade generally. Once again, the statist is motivated to accumulate and maintain his authority, whereas the conservative is motivated to preserve and improve the civil society. The statist also uses the idea of global citizenship to denigrate the effectiveness of war efforts that he does not lead, and agitate the public against his political opponents. Indeed, the statist adopts the language and tactics of America's adversaries in criticizing American foreign and national security policies. For example, in the war on terrorism, the United States has been accused by various countries, self-described human rights groups, international bureaucrats, among others, of using torture in the interrogation and detention of al-Qaeda terrorists. These critics have attacked critically important, albeit rarely used, methodologies for securing intelligence and neutralizing the enemy as violations of terrorists' human rights, including waterboarding, which simulates drowning. The technique has now been banned, but was used on only 3 terrorists: Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, Abu Zubaydah, Osama bin Laden's chief of operations, and Abdalrahim al-Nashiri, who the government says coordinated the attack on the USS Cole. The technique reportedly led to securing important information that prevented dozens of planned al-Qaeda attacks. The statist has succeeded in characterizing something as torture that is not torture, for the purpose of banning even its judicious use. How is banning waterboarding, which Barack Obama did among his first acts as president, morally defensible when a few minutes of simulated drowning applied against the operational leader of 9/11 reportedly saved an untold number of innocent American lives? Even the detention of al-Qaeda terrorists at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, under the watchful eyes of the media, anti-war groups, defense lawyers, and statist politicians who have toured the detention center over a period of years, has been made controversial. Obama also issued an executive order that will close the facility within a year of his taking office. And the insistence on treating the detained terrorists as soldiers under international law, the Geneva Conventions, which specifically excludes them from such a designation since they are waging war illegally, and also treating them as quasi-American citizens for the purpose of applying constitutional-like due process standards in determining their fate, flies in the face of legal and historical precedent. How does American society benefit from these approaches? Terrorists, the earliest of whom were pirates, have never been considered equivalent to regular armed forces by any president up to now. Granting new rights to terrorists, which makes their barbarism more difficult to stop and their schemes more difficult to uncover, is not morally defensible. While empowering the terrorist with new rights, thereby increasing the threat against Americans, the statist claims violations of American civil liberties with the passage of the post-9/11 Patriot Act. As former terrorist prosecutor Andrew McCarthy has explained, the act removes obstacles that have, for years, prevented the law enforcement and counterintelligence sides of the government from pooling information to confront the terrorist threat. And it ushers several long-established investigative techniques into the era of 21st century technology, bringing them to bear on terrorism with the same effectiveness they have long exhibited in rooting out far less heinous crimes, such as drug trafficking and healthcare fraud. The law provides for judicial review at every important stage as well. The statist also has opposed the interception of enemy communications, such as email and cell phone contacts, without approval from a court. But his position is contrary to all legal precedent, historical practice, and highly impractical, given the speed by which such communications occur. Yet again he claims the practice threatens American civil liberties. Where is the actual evidence of widespread civil liberties abuses against American citizens? It is non-existent. The war against terrorism requires infiltration, interception, detention, and interrogation, all of which are aimed at preventing another catastrophic attack against American citizens within the United States and American soldiers on the battlefield. The post-9/11 mix of laws and policies instituted by President George W. Bush, which are intended to protect American society from mortal threats, did in fact succeed in securing the American people's unalienable rights within the framework of the Constitution. The statist knows this, but he is intolerant of the successful leadership of others, for it delays his own ascendancy. He must denigrate those who obstruct him, and once in power, his threshold for actual civil liberties violations is often lowered. During World War II, Franklin Roosevelt ordered the unconstitutional internment of 110,000 Japanese Americans, which was upheld by an activist Supreme Court. Roosevelt remains among the statists' most adored leaders, and the court among his most venerated institutions. When Robert Kennedy served as Attorney General of the United States in the 1960s, he did nothing to stop the illegal bugging of Martin Luther King Jr.'s telephone by the FBI. Today, the Federal Justice Department building is named after Kennedy. Under President Bill Clinton, the National Security Agency launched the Echelon Surveillance Program, in which the U.S. government routinely intercepts international email, telephone, and fax communications of citizen and terrorist alike. It drew virtually no attention from self-identified civil libertarian groups. For the conservative, there is no doubt that the relentless efforts of the statists to criminalize war, by dragging strategic and operational decisions into the courtroom, where inexpert judicial activists second-guess an elected president and his military and intelligence experts, will make securing the nation against future attacks far more difficult. The extent to which the statist is willing to expose the nation to known external threats during wartime demonstrates the zealotry with which he now pursues his ambitions.
America is an imperialist nation and a constant threat to world peace. A threat to the survival of the planet. The Reverend Jeremiah Wright, erstwhile pastor to Barack Obama, hardly rants alone in his ferocious denunciations of American imperialism, arrogance, corruption, and cruelty. Though videotape of the Rabid Rev's greatest hits simultaneously shocked and fascinated the public in the heat of the 2008 presidential campaign, his volcanic eruptions, including the ever-popular "God Damn America" sermonette, actually reflected the views of leading academics, activists, literary figures, and celebrities in treating USA as a three-letter acronym for absolute evil. On the first Sunday after September 11, 2001, Pastor Wright famously told his enthusiastically cheering congregation that guilty America deserved the devastating attacks we had received. "We took this country by terror away from the Sioux, the Apache, the Arawak, the Comanche, the Arapaho, the Navajo. Terrorism! We took Africans from their country to build our way of ease and kept them enslaved and living in fear. Terrorism! We bombed Grenada and killed innocent civilians, babies, non-military personnel. We bombed the black civilian community of Panama with stealth bombers and killed unarmed teenagers and toddlers, pregnant mothers, and hard-working fathers. We bombed Gaddafi's home and killed his child. Blessed are they who bash your children's head against a rock. We bombed Iraq. We killed unarmed civilians trying to make a living. We bombed a plant in Sudan to pay back for the attack on our embassy. Killed hundreds of hard-working people, mothers and fathers, who left home to go that day, not knowing they would never get back home. We bombed Hiroshima, we bombed Nagasaki, and we nuked far more than the thousands in New York and the Pentagon, and we never batted an eye. Kids playing in the playground, mothers picking up children after school, civilians, not soldiers, people just trying to make it day by day. We have supported state terrorism against the Palestinians and black South Africans, and now we are indignant because the stuff we have done overseas has now been brought back into our own front yards. Apologists for Dr. Wright attempt to explain, if not excuse, his diatribes with reference to black rage, the righteous wrath inspired by 400 years of slavery and racism. But similar sentiments emerge from other angry commentators with altogether dissimilar backgrounds. The multi-millionaire Hollywood filmmaker Michael Moore, for instance, regularly decries the horrible impact of America's global role and gleefully awaits the destruction of the American empire. In his Little Scene 1998 release, The Big One, about the book tour for his bestseller Downsize This, the portly provocateur and the world's most successful documentarian delivers the rousing punchline, one evil empire down, one more to go. This same effort to equate today's United States with the old Soviet Union characterizes the work of Chalmers Johnson, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego. Summarizing themes in his sunny 2007 feel-good book, Nemesis, The Last Days of the American Republic, Johnson declared, "When Ronald Reagan coined the phrase evil empire, he was referring to the Soviet Union, and I basically agreed with him that the USSR needed to be contained and checkmated. But today, it is the US that is widely perceived as an evil empire, and world forces are gathering to stop us." Many domestic radicals, including tenured professors, proudly volunteer to join that international anti-American effort. Viewing the United States as a threat to world peace and a menace to the security and prosperity of other nations, they reject traditional notions of patriotism. Robert Jensen has taught journalism at the University of Texas since 1992, and on a half-dozen electrifying occasions, he argued with me and my listeners as a guest on my radio show. In his 2004 book, Citizens of the Empire, The Struggle to Claim Our Humanity, he boldly asserted, "It is time to scrap patriotism. More specifically, it is crucial to scrap patriotism in today's empire, the United States, where patriotism is not only a bad idea, but literally a threat to the survival of the planet." On a similarly sour note, in January 2006, Los Angeles Times columnist Joel Stein proudly announced, "I don't support the troops. When you volunteer for the U.S. military, you're willingly signing up to be a fighting tool of American imperialism. We shouldn't be celebrating people for doing something we don't think was a good idea." The notion of a malevolent American empire, of U.S. imperialism as a long-standing threat to all of humanity, has become such a common feature of enlightened opinion that an angry Nobel Prize acceptance speech advancing such ideas provoked scant controversy and attracted little attention. The British playwright Harold Pinter, author of joyless, often inscrutable dramas and screenplays of singular pomposity, won the Nobel Prize for Literature and used the occasion to denounce the United States and all its works. In his Pearl Harbor Day Nobel lecture of December 7, 2005, Pinter launched his own sneak attack on his American cousins. "The crimes of the United States," he announced, "have been systematic, constant, vicious, remorseless, but very few people have actually talked about them. You have to hand it to America. It has exercised a quite clinical manipulation of power worldwide while masquerading as a force for universal good. It's a brilliant, even witty, highly successful act of hypnosis. I put to you that the United States is without doubt the greatest show on the road. Brutal, indifferent, scornful, and ruthless it may be, but it is also very clever. As a salesman, it is out on its own, and its most saleable commodity is self-love." He went on to scold the United States for its 8,000 active and operational nuclear warheads. Who, I wonder, are they aiming at? Osama bin Laden? You? Me? Joe Dokes? China? Paris? Who knows? What we do know is that this infantile insanity, the possession and theoretical use of nuclear weapons, is at the heart of the present American political philosophy. We must remind ourselves that the United States is on a permanent military footing and shows no sign of relaxing it. While outspoken leftists such as Pastor Wright and playwright Pinter accuse the United States of a long history of exploitative, arrogant militarism, going back to the early treatment of Native Americans and the very origins of the nation, a strain of anti-imperialist hysteria on the right suggests that our arrogant role in world affairs represents a recent alien aberration imposed on a previously honorable republic by some vile conspiracy of globalists or neocons. These impassioned critics of the current war on terror conjure up images of an idyllic, noble, non-interventionist past, with Americans prospering peacefully and resisting entanglement in the old world's corrupt and needless conflicts, and our judicious leaders displaying the good sense to avoid meddling in the business of other nations. Only recently, they argue, has the Republic involved itself in pointless, dangerous, and undeclared wars that sacrifice the true national interest for the sake of privileged but secretive economic elites. Why are we determined to follow a foreign policy of empire building and preemption, which is unbecoming of a constitutional republic? Asked Congressman Ron Paul, Republican Texas, whose 2008 presidential campaign made him something of a cult leader among angry activists who felt deeply disaffected from the aggressive internationalism of their government. In a February 2007 statement on Iraq policy that amounted to Dr. Paul's very own Valentine to the Bush administration, and received wide internet circulation under the heading, "The Neoconservative Empire," the indignant Texan complained, "Those on the right should recall that the traditional conservative position of non-intervention was their position for most of the 20th century. Special interests and the demented philosophy of conquest have driven most wars throughout history. In recent decades, our policies have been driven by neoconservative empire radicalism, profiteering in the military-industrial complex, misplaced do-good internationalism, mercantilistic notions regarding the need to control natural resources, and blind loyalty to various governments in the Middle East." Both views of American imperialism badly misstate our history, distort our present policies, and require correction. No, the involvement in far-flung, often unpopular conflicts doesn't represent a recent innovation or the result of some conspiratorial takeover of U.S. foreign policy. Military involvement in remote corners of the globe characterized every stage of our emergence as a world power. And the purpose of these numerous conflicts and interventions bore little connection to colonialism or conquest or empire building in the classical sense, and more often displayed surprisingly and surpassingly unselfish intentions. Moreover, regardless of the true reasons or the often arguable wisdom behind these frequent military or diplomatic initiatives, their overall long-term impact most often benefited the peoples involved as well as the world at large. Unlike other empires in human history, the powerful and globe-straddling American sphere of influence has generally promoted the cause of both prosperity and liberty. Nothing new in foreign fights. The United States fought its first war against Islamic extremism more than 200 years ago, producing inspiring victories in exotic locales, a line in the first verse of the Marines' hymn, "To the Shores of Tripoli," our first great post-revolutionary military hero, Stephen Decatur, and his immortal toast, "Our country, in her intercourse with foreign nations, may she always be in the right, but our country, right or wrong." The First Barbary War, 1801-5, lasted 4 years after President Thomas Jefferson sent the new Navy to the distant Mediterranean to protect American interests and honor. The semi-independent North African nations of Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripoli, today's Libya, functioned like modern-day state sponsors of terrorism, backing ruthless pirates who devastated U.S. shipping unless Washington delivered lavish tribute to the local authorities. When Jefferson stopped the bribes and made war successfully on the Barbary states and their fanatical rulers without a formal declaration from Congress, he helped establish a long-standing tradition of small wars or so-called low-intensity conflicts. As Max Boot points out in his superb and eye-opening 2002 book, The Savage Wars of Peace, there is another, less celebrated tradition in U.S. military history, a tradition of fighting small wars. Between 1800 and 1934, U.S. Marines staged 180 landings abroad. The Army and Navy added a few small-scale engagements of their own. Some of these excursions resulted in heavy casualties. Others involved almost no fighting. Some were successful, others not. But most of these campaigns were fought by a relatively small number of professional soldiers pursuing limited objectives with limited means. These are the non-wars that Kipling called the savage wars of peace. Ignoring the long record of American involvement in such conflicts in every region of the globe, those who question our current worldwide role express reverence for a simple-minded and non-existent tradition of isolationism. They cite George Washington's words in his celebrated farewell address of 1796. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. 'Tis our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Jefferson also warned against entangling alliances. At the same time, he negotiated a vast expansion of U.S. territory with France, the Louisiana Purchase, and pursued the daring and difficult Barbary Wars. Even Pat Buchanan, the three-time presidential candidate most often identified as a contemporary advocate of isolationism, rejects the idea that the nation ever cowered behind its Atlantic and Pacific water walls. In his provocative, beautifully written book, A Republic, Not an Empire, 1999, Buchanan argues, the idea that America was ever an isolationist nation is a myth. A useful myth, to be sure, but nonetheless a malevolent myth that approaches the status of a big lie. What is derided today as isolationism was the foreign policy under which the Republic grew from 13 states on the Atlantic into a continent-wide nation that dominated the hemisphere and whose power reached to Peking. To call the foreign policy that produced this result isolationist is absurd. Americans were willing to go to war with the greatest powers in Europe, but only for American interests. They had no wish to take sides in European wars in which America had no stake. Donald Kagan makes a similar case in Dangerous Nation, 2006, insisting that many Americans remain misled or ill-informed about our purportedly isolationist past. This gap between Americans' self-perception and the perceptions of others has endured throughout the nation's history, he writes. Americans have cherished an image of themselves as by nature inward-looking and aloof, only sporadically and spasmodically venturing forth into the world, usually in response to external attack or perceived threats. This self-image survives despite 400 years of steady expansion and an ever-deepening involvement in world affairs, and despite innumerable wars, interventions, and prolonged occupations in foreign lands. Even as the United States has risen to a position of global hegemony, expanding its reach and purview and involvement across the continent and then across the ocean, Americans still believe their nation's natural tendencies are toward passivity, indifference, and insularity. This misconception helped to produce one of the most common and ignorant indictments of the Iraq War, with angry critics of Bush's policy emphatically insisting, "This is the first time in history we ever attacked any country that hadn't attacked us first." In fact, virtually all our major wars began without some clear-cut enemy attack on American soil. The French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, Korea, Vietnam, and the First Gulf War engaged the armed might of the nation based on incidents or interests, but not in response to sneak attack or mass assault. In 230 years of history, only the Civil War, where Lincoln cleverly lured Southern forces into the initial bombardment of federal property at Fort Sumter, and World War II, where Japan struck at precisely one of those outposts of empire in distant Hawaii that anti-imperialists often decry, brought our forces into battle in response to blatant enemy strikes. Sidebar: insurgents play politics, and not just in Iraq. Well before Iraq and even Vietnam, ruthless insurgents relied on anti-war agitation in the United States to provide victories they couldn't win in battle. Between 1898 and 1902, some of America's most esteemed individuals condemned the punishing war in the jungles of the Philippines, including former President Grover Cleveland, labor leader Samuel Gompers, social reformer Jane Addams, and industrialist Andrew Carnegie, who offered $20 million to buy the Philippines to grant the islands their independence. Wily Filipino leader Emilio Aguinaldo deliberately intensified his guerrilla activity in the months before the 1900 election in hopes of handing the presidency to anti-imperialist candidate William Jennings Bryan. Some of the Democrats' supporters explicitly hoped for Filipino victory against our army of subjugation, tyranny, and oppression, while Mark Twain, condemning atrocities by U.S. forces, suggested redesign of the Stars and Stripes with the white stripes painted black and the stars replaced by the skull and crossbones. American soldiers in the Philippines deeply resented anti-war protests back home. Major General Henry Lawton, a Medal of Honor winner for his spectacular bravery in the war between the states, grumbled, "If I am shot by a Filipino bullet, it might just as well come from one of my own men, because the continuance of the fighting is chiefly due to reports that are sent from America." He received just such a fatal bullet a few weeks later, picked off by an insurgent sharpshooter. Nevertheless, voters turned against anti-war politicians and gave the GOP ticket of William McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt a landslide victory. Less than 7 years later, with the insurrection crushed, the Filipinos convened an elected legislature, the first anywhere in Asia. In 1946, the islands achieved final independence. Temporary missions, not permanent conquests. While America's record clearly clashes with the isolationist and quiescent stereotypes that many anti-interventionists revere, the nation's traditions also bear little resemblance to the colonialist and imperialist selfishness associated with the European powers. Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and even tiny Belgium established far-flung empires, planting their flags and seizing political control of subject peoples and territory in Africa, Asia, and the Western Hemisphere. But the United States generally avoided the temptations of conquest. We fought our one frankly imperialist war, the Spanish-American conflict of 1898, primarily over the future of Cuba, just 90 miles from the shores of Florida, yet made no attempt to incorporate the promising island as part of American territory. Within 4 years of our quick one-sided victory over the Spanish colonialists, we withdrew our troops and recognized Cuban independence. Even the bloodiest, most fiercely resisted, and longest-standing U.S. occupations, as in the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century, resulted ultimately in the voluntary departure of American forces. Whatever the varied purposes of our many foreign adventures beyond the North American continent, conquest and territorial expansion played little role in shaping our policy. The nation's lack of imperial designs revealed itself most clearly, perhaps, at the Versailles Conference following America's triumphant and very costly involvement in World War I. More than 100,000 U.S. servicemen perished in the conflict. An American entry into the war unequivocally turned the tide of battle and brought the Allied victory. Despite the fact that President Woodrow Wilson clearly dominated the proceedings of the peace conference, hailed as a virtual messiah when he arrived in Europe after the war, the United States remained the only one of the major victorious Allied powers that sought no territorial or colonial enhancement at Versailles. France, Italy, and even Denmark, Belgium, Greece, and Romania won new territory in the negotiations. But the Americans asked only for enough land to bury their dead. In 1942, the historian Rupert Emerson declared, "With the exception of the brief period of imperialist activity at the time of the Spanish-American War, the American people have shown a deep repugnance to both the conquest of distant lands and the assumption of rule over alien peoples." In the more than 65 eventful years since Emerson's observation, this deep repugnance remains a prominent feature of American public opinion and has helped to shape foreign policy. The bloody and seemingly innumerable foreign wars of the 20th century saw American troops deployed to every corner of the planet. But for the most part, they came home at the earliest opportunity. President Wilson dispatched more than 2 million American soldiers to France to win World War I. But in less than 2 years, they had all left the old world behind. The 60-year presence of American forces in Europe and Japan following World War II not only decreased dramatically after the demise of the Soviet threat, but continues today at the insistence of the host countries. Aside from the economic benefits to local economies from the numerous American bases, U.S. troops, for better or worse, provide a security shield that has allowed our European allies to scrimp on defense spending, making no attempt to develop military resources commensurate with their economic or political power. In any event, not even the most implacable anti-American could describe today's robust and reunited Germany as a restive, captive society crushed by Yankee imperialism because of the ongoing presence of the U.S. Army on its soil. By the same token, the 29,000 American troops who remain in South Korea for defensive purposes more than a half-century after the armistice with the North hardly constitute an occupation force or have prevented the nation's dazzling prosperity and democratization. These long-term military assignments represent prominent exceptions to the general American rule of quick, short-term interventions rather than permanent conquests. In 1848, victorious troops marched into Mexico City after the crushing defeat of that nation's vaunted military machine. Jingoes at home demanded the annexation of all Mexico, but instead President James K. Polk accepted a treaty that added to the nation the sparsely populated territory of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah. Texas had achieved its own independence from Mexico 11 years before. Rather than simply imposing its will on a conquered neighbor, the United States agreed to assume Mexico's burdensome national debt of $3.25 million and to pay the government a surprisingly lavish sum of $15 million more. After the settlement, Washington made no attempt to maintain American forces or bases on Mexican soil. The same pattern applied almost everywhere, with American withdrawal following even the bloodiest, most punishing military struggles. In Dangerous Nation, Robert Kagan discerns this same impatience in the reconstruction of the American South after the war between the states. In our nation's first exercise in nation building, the federal government ultimately failed because it allotted only 12 years before withdrawing Union troops as part of the compromise that settled the disputed election of 1876 and abandoning the ambitious effort to guarantee justice and security for former slaves. This limited appetite for occupation and rebuilding has bedeviled post-war policies far more than any desire for permanent presence, leading to problematic and truncated missions in conflicts ranging from the Barbary Wars of the early 1800s to the First Gulf War and the Somali intervention of the early 1990s. Osama bin Laden pointed to America's humiliation in Somalia, where 18 mutilated soldiers in the Black Hawk Down episode led to a hasty American withdrawal, as one of the incidents that led him to characterize the United States as a paper tiger with no staying power. Bin Laden also mentioned the U.S. departure from Lebanon after the 1983 Hezbollah suicide bombing that killed 241 Marines, and particularly noted the way that public impatience and exhaustion brought about the retreat from Vietnam. Ironically, by focusing on the American penchant for quick withdrawals from the world's hotspots, our primary terrorist adversary undermined his own characterization of the United States as a ruthless imperialist power. Even the long-standing and often bloody U.S. mission to the Philippines culminated in American decisions to forego any imperial role and resulted in Filipino independence and flawed democracy. The United States seized the former Spanish colony with little difficulty at the outset of the Spanish-American War, but then suppressed a stubborn nationalist insurrection, 1898 to 1902, that killed more than 4,000 American troops and some 200,000 Filipinos. This nightmare didn't stop the American authorities from setting up an elected legislative assembly 5 years later, with a U.S.-style bicameral legislature by 1916. In 1935, the Philippines achieved full internal self-government and, after a brutal Japanese occupation during World War II, gained complete independence, together with massive U.S. Reconstruction aid in 1946. America's renunciation of any colonial role in the Philippines, even after massive sacrifices over the course of nearly a half-century, in no sense demonstrates a typically imperialist approach. Above all, those enraged voices that tirelessly damn the United States as a rapacious, insatiable, imperialistic power must somehow explain the continued independent existence of the nation of Canada. Alongside our allegedly land-hungry and bellicose empire, the Maple Leaf Republic has flourished for more than 2 centuries, vast, underpopulated, resource-rich, and virtually defenseless. Unlike our Mexican neighbors to the south, the Canadians presented no substantial cultural or linguistic differences to sour the prospect of swallowing the Great White North. On 3 different occasions, Americans attempted or considered a push to absorb all or part of Canada. During the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the complicated Venezuela boundary crisis with Great Britain in 1895. Nevertheless, the Yankee imperialists stopped well short of conquest, and in the 21st century era of unchallenged U.S. hegemony, Canada has gone its own quirky way, more notably than ever before, reveling in its separate destiny and distinctive institutions. The history of U.S. respect for Canada's continued sovereignty hardly comports with the prevailing anti-American cliches that suggest Americans long to impose on all the world the same genocidal approach we deployed against the Indians. Sidebar: not enough tyrannizing. The extension of American power to distant territories and initially hostile cultures never depended on military force alone. In the grueling struggle in the Philippines, for instance, the United States succeeded through generous policies during the occupation as much as through courage on the battlefield. Max Boot describes U.S. efforts in the savage wars of peace. Soldiers built schools, ran sanitation campaigns, vaccinated people, collected customs duties, set up courts run by natives, supervised municipal elections, and generally administered governmental functions efficiently and honestly. 1,000 idealistic young American civilians even journeyed to the Philippines to teach school in a precursor of the Peace Corps. Manuel Quezon, who became the first president of the Autonomous Commonwealth of the Philippines in 1935, once served as a major in Aguinaldo's army and lamented the American kindness that undermined the insurrection. "Damn the Americans," he wailed. "Why don't they tyrannize us more?" Conquest by Americanization, not Americanization by conquest. As to the territories the United States added as part of its ongoing westward expansion in North America, none of these acquisitions followed the normal colonial pattern of invasion and subjugation of hostile native populations. In all cases, America annexed or negotiated for sparsely populated tracts of land in which U.S. settlers had already established flourishing communities. Before the United States acquired West Florida from Spain, or Oregon and Washington from Great Britain, or California, Texas, and the Southwest from Mexico, or even the Louisiana Purchase from France, U.S. citizens had already rushed into these territories and, to some extent, Americanized them. For example, more than 30,000 Americans settled in Texas with the permission of the Spanish colonial and Mexican governments, and by 1835, the time of the War for Texas independence, they outnumbered their Mexican neighbors by at least 8-1. Even the annexation of Hawaii confirmed rather than began U.S. domination. American traders and whalers played a prominent role in the islands beginning in the 1780s, and the arrival of U.S. missionaries in the 1820s led to the rapid spread of Christianity, literacy, and civil institutions. As early as 1854, the native Hawaiian government formally applied to Congress for admission to the Union as an American state, bypassing the normal territorial phase. Because the Hawaiians insisted on joining the Republic as a free state, the slaveholding South blocked their bid for instant statehood. Robert Kagan writes that some 30 years later, Hawaii had become a virtual economic colony of the United States. Hawaiian products sold to the United States, mostly sugar, constituted 99% of all the island's exports, while the United States supplied 3/4 of all Hawaii's imports. American-born settlers, the sons and daughters of missionaries and whalers, had over the years become a dominant economic and political force on the islands. Over time, the American and other light-skinned merchants in Hawaii agitated for political rights and a political system more closely attuned to their political and economic interests. This led to an elected legislature, the decline of the monarchy, the establishment of a republic in 1894, territorial status in 1900, and statehood in 1959. As in the other permanent additions to U.S. territory, it wasn't invading armies that made Hawaii part of the nation, but independent-minded immigrants and settlers acting for their own advancement without governmental sponsorship or sanction, and establishing American communities that made U.S. acquisition not only possible, but inevitable. No lust for dominance. The notion of America as liberator of the world animated the Republic and its politics long before the globe-girdling wars of the 20th century. As one-time Jefferson biographer Christopher Hitchens noted in a column on imperialism for Slate, when founders like Alexander Hamilton spoke of a coming American empire, they arguably employed the word in a classical and metaphorical sense, speaking of the future dominion of the continent. By that standard, Lewis and Clark were the originators of American imperialism. Anti-imperialists of the colonial era would not count as such today. That old radical Thomas Paine was forever at Jefferson's elbow, urging that the United States become a superpower for democracy. He hoped that America would destroy the old European empires. As early as 1838, a Jacksonian newspaper called The Democratic Review published a soaring description of America's destined international role that might bring a blush to the cheek of even the most visionary neocon. The far-reaching, the boundless future will be the era of American greatness, the paper wrote. In its magnificent domain of space and time, the nation of many nations is destined to manifest to mankind the excellence of divine principles, to establish on earth the noblest temple ever dedicated to the worship of the Most High, the sacred and the true. Its floor shall be a hemisphere, its roof the firmament of the star-studded heavens, and its congregation the union of many republics, comprising hundreds of happy millions, calling and owning no man master, but governed by God's natural and moral law of equality, the law of brotherhood, of peace and goodwill among men. Otto von Bismarck might boast of building the German Reich on the basis of blood and iron, but the United States consistently viewed its international mission in deeply Christian Messianic terms. After deciding on an ongoing American role in the Philippines, President William McKinley granted a White House interview to the General Missionary Committee of the Methodist Episcopal Church. "I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight," the president revealed, And I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed to Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night late, it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift them and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. And then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly. And the next morning, I sent for the chief engineer of the War Department, and I told him to put the Philippines on the map of the United States. And there they are, and there they will stay while I am president. One can scoff at such naivete and sentimentality, just as many Americans scoffed at the soaring rhetoric of George W. Bush in his second inaugural address, with its promise to eliminate tyranny and promote democracy around the world. Nevertheless, such ideals about the U.S. obligation to less fortunate peoples have always played a role in shaping American policy and mobilizing public support for our most risky and costly international initiatives. The sincerely held notion of an American mission helps to explain the apparent contradictions in the U.S. approach to the world. We're reluctant and embarrassed to pursue raw power for its own sake, but we can be shockingly aggressive, even militant, when it comes to promoting democracy, free markets, and Christianity. Not surprisingly, this restless and sometimes misapplied idealism led to the worldwide categorization of the United States as a very dangerous member of the Society of Nations, in the 1817 phrase of America's ambassador in London, John Quincy Adams, feared and distrusted as much for its ideological and cultural distinctiveness as for its burgeoning power. Donald Kagan, who paraphrased Adams for the title of his influential book, Dangerous Nation, writes, "But aggressive territorial expansionism was not the only quality that made the young American Republic dangerous in the eyes of others. Of equal, if not sometimes greater concern, was the danger posed by America's revolutionary ideology, as well as by the way its liberal, commercial society seemed to swallow up those cultures with which it came into contact." This tendency to devour less vital systems and societies not only reflected the nation's democratic assertiveness, but also brought obvious financial benefits. In a fascinating 2007 book called Day of Empire, about the emergence of a succession of hyperpowers, Professor Amy Chua of Yale Law School writes that America built its world dominance not through conquest but commerce, creating an informal empire based on trade and influence. Chua cites economic historian John Steele Gordon, who writes, "If the world is becoming rapidly Americanized, as once it became Romanized, the reason lies not in our weapons, but in the fact that others want what we have, and are willing, often eager, to adopt our ways in order to have them too." While the soft power of U.S. culture and corporations ultimately wields more influence than our military strength, America has pursued numerous humanitarian interventions over the centuries that in no way serve either our financial or strategic self-interest. The recent military missions in Haiti, Somalia, Bosnia, and Kosovo brought scant reward to the United States while managing with varying degrees of success to save lives. Nearly a century earlier, the Boxer Uprising shook China and, as Max Boot writes, America joined in a multinational expedition to rescue the besieged legations in Peking, while the Europeans and Japanese participants were determined to carve out their own spheres of influence in China. The United States pointedly committed itself to maintaining free trade for all, the open door. Unlike other dominant powers in world history, the United States today remains less focused on enhancing its own sway than on promoting the stability and institutions that have allowed it to flourish. As Amy Chua concludes, Even when the United States invades and occupies other countries, the goal today is never annexation, but at least ostensibly an eventual military withdrawal, leaving behind a constitutional and hopefully pro-American democracy. Energized and enriched by America. The strongest, most direct evidence against the indictment of America as a destructive imperial power comes from a consideration of the progress of those nations most closely involved with the United States. It is no accident that the two nations of East Asia, with the most vibrant economies and the most robust democratic institutions, Japan and South Korea, are precisely those two nations with the most intimate association with the United States and with, in fact, the continued presence of thousands of American troops on their native soil. In the long term, the states and peoples who aligned themselves with America in world affairs, and even those nations that experienced lengthy American occupations, prospered economically and developed functioning democratic institutions. Just consider the experience of America's Western European allies, and even of our one-time enemies in Germany, Italy, and Japan. The phrase, "the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming," featured in George M. Cohan's stirring World War I rabble-rouser, Over There, most often signaled a nation's immediate liberation, and never meant its long-term destruction or conquest. It's also revealing to note the fate of divided nations split between a pro-American segment and an anti-American counterpart. The United States surely deserves credit for the vastly more fortunate circumstances of South Korea over North Korea. According to UN statistics, South Korea boasts a per capita gross domestic product 25 times greater than North Korea's, $25,840 versus $1,007. An astonishing ratio for two neighboring, ethnically identical countries. America's influence also contributed to the relative freedom and prosperity of the former West Germany compared to East Germany, and even to the superior development and free institutions in small, pro-Western Chinese enclaves, Taiwan, Hong Kong, compared to mainland China. Moreover, developing states that have realigned from an anti-American position to a policy of cooperation and commercial connection with the United States have gained enormous and obvious benefits. Most notably, the former states of the Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe, the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and others, entered periods of dramatic growth and democratization after the collapse of the Russian Empire. By the same token, nations that shifted from affiliation with the West to a posture of anti-Americanism, Cuba in 1959, Iran in 1979, suffered spectacularly. It's far more than a matter of U.S. power rewarding our friends and punishing our enemies. The record in every corner of the world suggests that the incorporation of American ideas of self-government and free markets leads to higher standards of living and more stable free institutions. Hawaii, the singularly favored aloha state beloved by tourists and locals alike, provides a particularly striking example of the blessings America imparts. Agitators who push for some form of native Hawaiian sovereignty or even a restoration of the 19th century monarchy ignore the basis for the state's distinction as by far the most prosperous, functional, and dynamic society in all the Polynesian islands. Fiji and Tahiti also feature stunning beaches and breathtaking landscape, but they're racked by chronic poverty, poor health, shaky institutions, and unreliable infrastructure. The undeniable success of the Hawaiian island chain, when compared to every other Pacific nation east of New Zealand, stems not from resources or historical accidents, but from the benevolent influence of American institutions and values. The real American crime: surrender, not intervention. To a surprising extent, the welfare of the world depends on American success. Other nations benefit through U.S. prosperity and power, just as the rest of humanity suffers from American reverses and defeats. The war in Vietnam remains a hotly debated topic among historians, with powerful recent arguments from Michael Lind, Vietnam, the Necessary War, and Mark Moyer, Triumph Forsaken, challenging the conventional wisdom that the United States blundered into a useless and unwinnable conflict. The hideous suffering of the people of Southeast Asia and their long-term oppression by cruel totalitarian regimes resulted from the ultimate defeat of U.S. policy aims, not from the original decision to support pro-Western governments in the region. The myth that American intervention caused the slaughter in Southeast Asia runs counter to the brute fact that the death rate, especially in Cambodia, intensified once U.S. troops went home. The Korean counterexample helps make the point that America's greatest crime in Vietnam involved Congress's 1975 decision, over the fervent objections of President Gerald Ford, to abandon our allies to our vicious enemies. In Korea, the people also suffered unspeakable casualties, but the perseverance of the United States preserved South Korea's independence and security to the eternal benefit of the 50 million who now inhabit an economic dynamo and flourishing democracy. The Vietnam experience showed the tragically high cost to our allies of American surrender. The most important argument for continued U.S. involvement in Iraq hinges on the importance of preventing the struggling Iraqi government from mirroring the Vietnam experience. Withdrawal would ensure a continued and even worsening regional bloodbath, with obvious consequences for American security. With all the danger and deprivation in the Middle East, the most wretched conditions in today's world still occur almost entirely in sub-Saharan Africa, where impoverished and violence-ridden nations complain far more frequently of too little U.S. involvement than they do of too much. The Clinton administration drew widespread criticism for its handling of the genocidal conflict in Rwanda. Though no one could blame the United States for provoking the slaughter, America earned ferocious denunciation for its failure to intervene. Crimes and context. In 1959, the hilarious Peter Sellers comedy The Mouse That Roared charmed audiences around the world by mocking America's long-standing reputation for prodigious generosity, especially to nations who fought the United States and lost. The movie, based on a droll and sprightly novel by Leonard Wibberley, tells the story of the fictional Duchy of Grand Fenwick, which decides to cope with imminent financial collapse by declaring war on the United States. The Grand Duchess and her Prime Minister, both played by Peter Sellers, unleashed the full might of a Fenwickian expeditionary force for an invasion of New York City, storming Manhattan with a 20-man army equipped with medieval armor and bows and arrows. The scheming Europeans naturally plan and advance for a speedy, abject surrender, after which they expect to benefit from the bountiful foreign aid and reconstruction assistance that America traditionally lavishes on its beaten foes. This good-natured spoof connected with moviegoers of the era precisely because they recognized elements of truth in its portrayal of America's bounteous naivete, satirizing a notorious national instinct to spread Yankee wealth even to obscure, powerless, and hostile nations. Ironically, the film appeared in the midst of the Cold War period, regularly characterized by revisionist historians and commentators, William Appleman Williams, Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, and many more, as the very height of U.S. arrogance and imperialism, when the American colossus needlessly menaced the appropriately frightened Soviet Union and ruthlessly imposed its will on allies and unaligned alike. Critics of the United States support their dark vision of its role in the world by concentrating on specific instances of bullying or brutality, trotting out their favorite horror stories from Indochina or Chile, Vietnam or Iraq, or dozens of other cases where American involvement imperfectly exemplified the nation's high ideals. These arguments lack perspective and ignore context. They emphasize details over destiny, appalling but isolated incidents over fateful long-term struggles. Anti-American scholars and agitators love to cite random crimes and blunders by U.S. troops and diplomats in order to smear the larger goals of the nation's policies, no matter how noble or necessary. No one, for instance, questions the righteous nature of America's determination to crush Hitlerism. But even in that epic struggle, our armed forces prove themselves capable of appalling cruelty. As Stanford professor Norman Naimark noted in the Weekly Standard, some 5 million Germans died during World War II, including 1.8 million civilians. Allied bombing campaigns, including the firebombing of Dresden and Hamburg, destroyed German cities and killed hundreds of thousands of their inhabitants, among them 75,000 children under 14. Many thousands of Germans starved to death, especially in the American Rheinwiesenlager, Rhine meadow camps. Others were beaten and horribly tortured. American soldiers sometimes shot Germans, usually SS and other uniformed Nazis, where they were found, and executed others without trial in detention camps. No American or German should have any illusions about the violence carried out by GIs and their officers against disarmed and interned German soldiers, policemen, and even civilians at the end of the war. The greatest generation committed crimes against captured Germans that make Abu Ghraib look like child's play. Naimark readily concedes, however, that it makes no sense to consider such atrocities outside the context of the wider war, just as it makes no sense to condemn the U.S. atom bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are you listening, Reverend Wright? Without reference to their ultimate life-saving role for both Americans and Japanese, who otherwise would have perished by the millions in a fight-to-the-death defense against a conventional invasion of the home islands. In the same way, it's impossible to indict America for its vigorous and sometimes overweening international role in the period 1945 to 1989 without consideration of the multi-generational, worldwide struggle against the aggressive force of worldwide communism. In his Nobel Prize lecture, Harold Pinter slimed the United States for causing hundreds of thousands of deaths with its support for every right-wing military dictatorship in the world, in Indonesia, Greece, Uruguay, Brazil, Paraguay, Haiti, Turkey, the Philippines, Guatemala, El Salvador, and of course, Chile. At no point, however, did Pinter remind his listeners that every one of these dictatorships played a role in the larger struggle against the Soviet Union and its repeatedly announced intentions to destroy the United States and its way of life. "We will bury you," warned Nikita Khrushchev. America bashers may insist that the Russian Empire never constituted a real threat to the West, and that militant anti-communists merely conjured up the specter of the Red Menace to serve their own power-mad ends. But the corpses piled high in much of Europe, Asia, and Latin America provide unimpeachable evidence to the contrary. The Black Book of Communism, Crimes, Terror, Repression, the 1997 compilation of research edited by French academician Stéphane Courtois, counts some 100 million victims of communist murder during the 20th century. This horrifying record, ignored by too many contemporary Americans, may not excuse American misdeeds of the Cold War period, but it certainly can help to explain them. Chile constitutes a favorite demonstration of American perfidy. As Pinter's speech showed, the horror of the United States inflicted upon Chile in 1973 can never be purged and can never be forgiven. But that nation faced dire and increasingly violent divisions even before the CIA-directed coup in 1973. In 1970, Dr. Salvador Allende had become the world's first democratically elected Marxist president and immediately launched a radical program of nationalization, wealth distribution, and social reform. More moderate Chileans feared the imminent imposition of a Castro-style dictatorship. Instead, Chile endured 17 years of authoritarian, right-wing, pro-American rule from General Augusto Pinochet, with ruthless persecution of suspected dissidents combined with audacious free market reforms. For all his brutality, Pinochet created the most dynamic economy in Latin America. And under American pressure, he allowed a referendum on his own rule in 1988, then gave up power altogether less than 2 years later. Today, Chile continues to benefit from a growing economy and stable democratic institutions with a freely elected socialist and female president. While the international left regularly blames the United States for installing Pinochet, America gets no credit for its decisive role in his removal. In the same way, critics assault the United States for backing the Filipino strongman Ferdinand Marcos, but never praise American policymakers for securing his peaceful removal and supporting the more democratically minded people power revolution of Corazon Aquino. When it came to supporting even the Earth's most loathsome dictator in order to achieve victory in a fateful struggle, liberal hero Franklin D. Roosevelt led the way. During World War II, the United States provided massive shipments of war materiel to Stalin himself, so that the Russian mass murderer could use the equipment against our common enemy, Hitler. Without the context of the ongoing life and death battle to destroy the Third Reich, it would have made no sense whatever to back one of the bloodiest tyrants in human history. But within the framework of the ongoing war, that backing proved decisive and indispensable. It's a mistake to evaluate a foreign policy, or for that matter, a military campaign, by emphasizing its tactical failures while ignoring its strategic successes. Those who concentrate on Cold War blunders by U.S. policymakers miss the most significant point of them all. America's strategies and sacrifices, doctrines and deceptions resulted in the most remarkable victory in our history, with nearly 500 million human beings liberated from Stalinist tyranny. The results everywhere in terms of vastly improved living standards and fresh blessings of freedom should speak for themselves. So should the USA's restraint, modesty, and generosity in responding to the collapse of its longtime Soviet rival. With America for the first time enjoying matchless power in a suddenly unipolar world, the new hyperpower made no attempt to abuse its standing. As Amy Chua writes, here was a society with unthinkable destructive capacity, facing no countervailing power. Yet it seemed to go without saying that the United States would not use its unrivaled force for territorial expansion or other aggressive imperialist ends. When it came to U.S. military might, the most controversial issues were whether the United States should intervene abroad for purely humanitarian reasons, as in Kosovo or Rwanda, and what America should do with its peace dividend, the billions of dollars the United States would no longer be spending on its military. Sidebar: no alternative to America. Fuad Ajami, Lebanese-born scholar at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, wrote in June of 2008, "Yes, it is not perfect, this republic of ours, but the possibilities for emancipation and self-improvement it offers are unmatched in other lands. It is one thing to rail against Pax Americana, but after the pollsters are gone, the truth of our contemporary order of states endures. We live in a world held by American power and benevolence. Nothing prettier or more just looms over the horizon." The Bedford Falls Experiment. After the Cold War, American power represents the one indispensable element in sustaining hopes for an ordered and peaceful world. Christopher Hitchens writes, "The plain fact remains that when the rest of the world wants anything done in a hurry, it applies to American power. If the Europeans or the United Nations had been left with the task, the European provinces of Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo would now be howling wildernesses, Kuwait would be the 19th province of a greater Iraq, and Afghanistan might still be under Taliban rule. In at least the first two of the above cases, it can't even be argued that American imperialism was the problem in the first place. This makes many of the critics of this imposing new order sound like the whimpering, resentful Judean subversives in The Life of Brian, squabbling among themselves about, what have the Romans ever done for us? Donald Kagan, reviewing the nation's ongoing struggle in April 2008 in The New Republic, notes that China and Russia may threaten American hegemony with a new axis of autocracy, but they understand and recognize the continued dominance of the United States. For all their growing wealth and influence, he writes, the 21st century autocracies remain a minority in the world. As some Chinese scholars put it, democratic liberalism became dominant after the fall of Soviet communism and is sustained by an international hierarchy dominated by the United States and its democratic allies, a U.S.-centered great power group. The Chinese and the Russians feel like outliers from this exclusive and powerful clique. You Western countries, you decide the rules, you give the grades, you say you have been a bad boy, complained one Chinese official at Davos this year. Putin also complains that we are constantly being taught about democracy. The best way to put America's place in the world in proper context is to call to mind a famous sequence from the most beloved Hollywood movie of them all. In It's a Wonderful Life, small-town banker George Bailey, Jimmy Stewart, contemplates a Christmas Eve suicide before guardian angel Clarence provides the ultimate life-affirming vision. He provides the disheartened hero with a dark, dysfunctional view of the town of Bedford Falls as it would have been if he had never drawn breath, the community taking shape without his good deeds and benevolent influence. With that sharper perspective, George can go home to his loving family to celebrate the holiday with gratitude and joy. Those who condemn the United States should perform a thought experiment involving a global Bedford Falls vision. Imagine that the United States had never become a world power, or never existed at all. Would the ideals of democracy and free markets wield the same power in the world? Would murderous dictatorships have claimed more victims or fewer? Would the community of nations strain under the lash of Nazism, communism, or some vicious combination of both? Would multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy flourish anywhere on earth without inspiration from the groundbreaking example of the USA? Would the threat of jihadist violence and resurgent Islamic fundamentalism menace humanity more grievously or not at all? No one can provide definitive, authoritative answers to such hypothetical questions, but merely confronting the questions should help put the American role in more complete perspective. Just as George Bailey's view of an alternative reality convinced him that it's a wonderful life, even the briefest contemplation of a world without America should persuade us that it's a wonderful nation and an indispensable boon to all of humanity.